All right. So what was I saying? Yeah, you got your lab practical Monday, so don't forget that. Now that's 5 and 7. Oh yeah, you told me that, University of Georgia. That's right. Wow. How long is the internship up at UA? Yeah, do reptiles and birds. Okay. So yeah, remember it's oh, very cool. That would be nice. How exciting. Medical internship. Very. That's awesome. All right, so lab exam 2. Remember, we're not doing fungus, okay? So don't worry about fungus for the lab exam. Don't worry about it for the lecture exam. So next week we have just the lab exam, and then Wednesday lecture is going to depend on how far we get between now and then. So we'll go ahead and get started today. If anybody does have any questions for me with the amphibians, work our way through them, get into the reptiles as much as we possibly can. I'd like to make it through the birds today. Yes, it is. There's still quite a lot of information, I admit. But I did, narrow down the chapters somewhat, so it should help at least a bit. But I do admit, of course, there's a lot of information. This is toward the end of the semester. We get a lot of it put on. Because for one thing, the vertebrates is a much bigger group, so that we're looking through the other groups. We kind of didn't have nearly the information we have for the vertebrate group, or the animal group in general. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. So we had moved our way through the fishes. We had moved our way through the lobe fin fish. We had moved our way and talked about the lung fish, and all of these fish that were still fish, that still remained in the waters, still lived their life as a fish. But nonetheless, as we've said before, there were those critters in some parts of that evolutionary bush that were kind of experimenting with other things. They were experimenting with different kinds of fins. They were experimenting with the ability to breathe atmospheric oxygen rather than using gills to extract oxygen, or in addition to extracting oxygen from gills. So we have these organisms, we have this tendency, just like we saw in the plants, for critters to be moving out of the water onto land, right? And of course, we've talked about why that's significant. Moving on the land would have been less competition for resources, more resources in general, more open area to explore. But when we move into the amphibians, we talk about critters that have sort of one leg in the water world and then one leg out here in the dry world. So they represent, sort of ecosystem-wise, a transitional species, don't they? About 6,000 species of amphibians, separated into 3 clades. Again, as I've said before, this would have been the first vertebrates to walk on land. Toward the end of the Devonian, about 360 million years ago, the world was very warm. It was very wet. There were a lot of swamps and marshes and all that sort of stuff. So this would have been perfect environment for critters like this to radiate out, right? If you think about amphibians today, they live in pretty much the same kind of environment. They need wet climates. There are some amphibians that live in colder climates, but for the most part, we're going to see an abundance of species found in the tropical and the wet climates. And again, this has a lot to do with the fact that not only do they have to, lay their eggs in water, but their skin is such that it's not. And this varies a little bit. Toads tend to be a little better at this, but their skin is not well suited for dealing with dry climates. So they're going to obviously going to find themselves gravitating toward those areas that are wetter and warmer. Now, when we think about the end of the Devonian 360 million years ago, and these guys climbing out onto the land, this is when we get that major radiation of terrestrial arthropods, right? There was lots for the amphibians to eat when they did finally move out on the land. Another big hallmark that we see that we haven't seen till now, although we see the beginnings of it, are legs, right? If you live on land, you're going to have legs in order to survive, and amphibians, for the most part, have legs. Now, there are a few amphibians that don't. For example, the caecilians. That's the caecilian in the picture that you see that looks like a worm. It's actually an amphibian, and they live a burrowing lifestyle. But even in some of these burrowing amphibians and some of these other burrowing critters or crawling critters that we're going to talk about, we find that in their ancestry, at one time, their ancestor did have legs. So very often what happens is organisms moved out on the land, developed legs, and then those who went a different route, burrowing, or if you think about snakes slithering along the ground, they secondarily would have lost their legs. Another interesting thing about amphibians is the ability to supplement oxygen taken in by the lungs through their skin, or what we call cutaneous respiration. You remember I've said before, among animals, any highly vascularized surface, any surface of skin or tissue that has a lot of blood vessels that is thin enough and kept moist enough will engage in diffusion. We talked about this, of course, when we were talking about mosses and why mosses stay small. So if you're using cutaneous respiration, you're not going to be a big organism. You're going to stay relatively small. There is actually a salamander, I think I showed to you later on in a picture here in Florida. Yeah, there's a native salamander. It's what we call the lungless salamander. It does not have lungs, completely dependent on cutaneous respiration. We also now see a pulmonary circuit in the circulatory system, where we didn't see that before. Remember, with the fish is a single loop circulatory system: heart through the gills, back through the rest of the body, back to the heart. Two-chambered heart, single circulatory system. When we get into the amphibians, though, then we get two circulations. We get the circulation through the body, which is the systemic circuit, and then we get the circulation through the lungs, or in the case of those who have cutaneous respiration, this would also be involved circulation through the skin, to the outer layers of the skin. However, even though this looks a lot like our circulatory system with its pulmonary and systemic, there is one major difference. Take a look at the heart. How many chambers do you see in that heart there? How many chambers in an amphibian heart? How many chambers does your heart have? Yeah, we got 4 chambers in our heart. How many chambers do you see in this heart? I see 2 atria or auricles, and I see 1 ventricle, right? We have 2 of each of those, don't we? Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, all right? So they do have the pulmonary and the systemic circuit, but the 3-chambered heart means that there's a compromise that's going to happen. You notice in the case of the 3-chambered heart, we get the deoxygenated blood that's traveling back from the body. That's the blue, right? And it empties into the auricle. Or in the atrium. We also have the blood that's returning to the heart back from the capillaries or the lungs, the part that's oxygenated. Now in our heart, those 2 parts are kept together, but in the amphibian heart, those 2 atria dump into 1 single ventricle where the blood is then mixed. And you see they're illustrating that in this illustration by the fact that they've colored that part purple. So you get a mixing of the blood. So when the ventricle pumps, and the ventricle is the pumping part of the heart, the auricles are the receiving parts of the heart. When that one ventricle pumps, it pumps blood both into the capillaries and into the rest of the body. So that means that the rest of the body never gets fully oxygenated blood, right? Because that fully oxygenated blood that's coming back from the capillaries mixes with the deoxygenated blood that's coming back from the body. Now, does this work? Well, obviously it does. These organisms have survived for 360 million years. So obviously having a 3-chambered heart in this type of circulatory system works. Now, is it as efficient as a 4-chambered heart? Well, no, it's not as efficient because you are mixing the blood. You're not getting fully oxygenated blood being transferred to the body. So how do these organisms deal with that? Well, organisms with lower metabolic rates, smaller organisms and that sort of stuff are going to allow this compromise to be effective in these critters. Remember what we said about an evolution, right? Evolution does not necessarily create perfect organisms. Organisms arise through natural selection and evolution to be very adapted to the environment that they're found in. So living an amphibian lifestyle, you can get away with the mixture of the blood. That would not work for those of us with higher metabolic rate like mammals or even in the birds. All right, you wouldn't be able to survive on a 3-chambered heart. Of course, another thing that happens when you separate the loops is in the systemic circuit, you get much higher blood pressure. And so that means there's a lot more blood being delivered to the tissues. So once again, an example that we see in evolution of something that does not look on the surface as to be the optimum, right? Mixing your blood is not the optimum, but it is optimum for the type of lifestyle these organisms live, right? And of course, the big thing about amphibians that we've talked about before is they have a dual lifestyle. This is one that's just about ready to leave that lifestyle of living in the water. It's going to lose that tail. The legs are nicely formed, and this individual eventually will crawl out of the water and become a frog. So in the middle of this slide, you can see from the embryo through the development of the tadpole, all the way through the development as the tail falls off and the legs begin to grow until we get this adult frog. So adult frogs lose their tails. Their tails are beneficial as a tadpole for swimming in water, but a tail on land, at least for the amphibians, is not necessary. Not all frogs lose their tails, by the way. I always want to show you an exception. This is what we call a spadefoot frog, and these frogs actually do have the remnants of a tail. Now, speaking of frogs and toads, what's the difference? Well, frogs tend to have smooth, moist skin. They tend to be jumpers, right? And these are the ones, if you're driving down the street, sometimes you can see these big bullfrogs, and they can jump. They can jump over the entire street from one side to the other. I mean, these are some long-distance jumpers. So they're going to have very long, strong back legs. Most of these guys, because of their smooth, moist skin, are going to live relatively near the water. That's different than in the toads. The toads have the bumpy, dry skin. That's why they can live in drier environments. Shorter legs means they're not jumpers, but they're hoppers. And if you think about it, if you've ever watched a frog or a toad move, a toad does move kind of in a hopping fashion, right? Whereas the frogs are more the jumpers. Now, reproduction. We mentioned before the idea of an egg. These organisms have an anamniotic egg. Now, we're going to look at egg biology or egg anatomy here more in just a couple of slides. But remember, without an amnion, there's no way to keep the fetus from drying out. Remember, the amnion is the sac with the amniotic fluid that allows that fetus to survive without drying out. But if you are laying eggs in water, you do not need an amnion. Right, so they have an amniotic egg. Fertilization is external. As a matter of fact, down here in the lower left, that's how it basically works. The male climbs on top of the female frog. They press their cloacas together. She begins to spawn eggs, and as those eggs are being spawned, he fertilizes them with sperm, and that's what you're seeing right here. This is the egg mass that's forming. And then again, of course, like we mentioned, they go through the tadpole. So looking at a frog again, smooth, moist skin, that's a frog. Poison dart frogs with their brightly colored, smooth, moist skins. Toads, lumpy, dry skin. All right, so you would typically tend to find frogs, again, like we say here, more closer to the water. Toads might be a little further away. Now, this group that we just went through with the frogs and the toads, these are known as the Anura. Well, it means without tail. Anura. These are the Anorans. These are the frogs and the toads. The next group are the individuals who had tails. So this is the amphibian clade known as the Caudata. This is going to be the salamanders and the newts. There's really not much difference between a salamander and a newt. They're basically the same thing. Long bodies with tails, smooth, moist skin, like the frogs. They're going to be found in moist habitats. Land dwellers, all right, and many times the land dwellers, even though these organisms have to go back to the water to lay eggs, they do engage in internal fertilization, which is something that's relatively common among land dwellers. The internal fertilization is done a little differently the way we do. A male presents a packet of sperm. See down below, a packet of sperm. Now, in the picture up above, you can see the human finger. This is what a little packet of salamander sperm would look like. So he hands that little packet of sperm, or that packet of sperm, to the female, inserts that in the female's cloaca, and that's how fertilization occurs. So it's a little different than the way we do it. Can you imagine, your husband or your boyfriend showing up? Look what I bought you, honey, a packet of sperm. Now, very different here in these organisms than the frogs, because the larvae, the young, look like the adults. So they're not going to go from something, from a tadpole, that much change into a frog. Juvenile salamanders and newts are pretty much going to look the same as the adults. So these are the salamanders, the newts, and some critters called the sirens. This is a siren. Sirens are aquatic. We have a couple of species of sirens in Florida. You're going to find those, a lot of those you can find in the lakes around here. There's some other cool pictures of salamanders. This is a newt, a red spotted newt. We have those in Florida. I've never seen one in Florida. I saw one in Vermont. They're just amazing when you see one. Just brilliant colors. This is the lungless one I was telling you about. This is the slimy salamander. That salamander occurs in Florida. I think this is a cool picture of a salamander. It's like it doesn't want to get his feet wet walking across the water. The salamander over here is another Florida species. This is the dusky salamander. Salamanders do get pretty good size. They're generally small, but you can see that picture there. This is in Indonesia somewhere. That's the world's largest salamander. That's a pretty good size salamander. And if you see down below, if you see down below, you can see that the salamander, these are the gills, right? So salamanders indicate their aquatic lifestyle, or part of the lifestyle being an aquatic by these gills. So these gills, in some species, would remain if they're going to be mostly in aquatic form, but in other species, those will eventually become, those gills will fade away, and they'll use either cutaneous or lung respiration. All right, so let's see. We got the non-tailed ones. We got the tailed ones. Now we got the ones without legs. Now this is an amphibian group you might not be as familiar with. This is the Apoda, typically tropical organisms, burrowing, legless, but ancestors. There's the ancestor of the Apoda amphibians did have legs. And that's something we see again in the snakes too. Similar idea with the snakes. And being that they're burrowing, not only is legless something that you might expect to find in a burrowing critter, but they're also nearly blind. Very small eyes, nearly blind. You don't. If you're a burrower, eyes are expensive sorts of things. So if you don't have to have eyes, then by all means, don't create eyes. Okay. Jaws, teeth, pretty good mouthful of teeth there. You can see in that picture. There's an Apoda. Very unique among these organisms is the teeth that we find. We don't generally find teeth in salamanders and frogs, but the Apoda amphibians do. Internal fertilization and maternal investment, a really bizarre type of maternal investment. Like you see this one over here on the right, the young, when they hatch, what they will do as larvae, they will, their feed, what they get from the mother, not milk obviously, because that's mammals, is they actually eat the skin of the mother. So they'll, not killing her, but they'll eat the skin of the mother as sustenance necessary for their further development until they move on being a salamander of their own. Another group of organisms that belongs in this group of the apods are called the Caecilians, and the Caecilians and the this is Caecilians, burrowers. This is another Caecilian. Some of them come on pretty cool colors, like that blue one there. These are the less well-known. I don't think I've ever seen a Caecilian amphibian. I've seen plenty of sirens, which kind of look like them. This is the siren, but that's an actual salamander relative. But this is a much less well-known. All right, so we got critters now that can move out away from water, but still have to go back to water to lay eggs. So let's make the next move and talk about the amniotic egg. What is it about the reptilian egg that allowed them to move away from the water? All right, well, the first thing, again, is the amniotic cavity. All right, here's the offspring surrounded by an amnion, that thing in the blue. In the amniotic cavity, there's amniotic fluid. That you're not going to find an amnion in amphibians. You're not going to find an amnion in fish. Those organisms don't need to worry about the young remaining moist because, of course, again, these eggs are laid in the water. But now reptiles and, of course, fish or birds, not fish, with this amniotic egg can take and lay that egg elsewhere because that fluid is already self-contained in the egg. All right, how about some of the other membranes? These are what we call the extra-embryonic membranes. Remember when I talked about animal development, I said when back in the morula, the cells are totipotent, which means that those cells can give rise to any tissue types, whether tissue types in the animal itself or these tissues, these extra-embryonic membranes. That was the definition of totipotent cell. So we talked about the amnion. The chorion. The chorion is for gas exchange. Many times the chorion will push right up against the side of the shell, and even though the shell, even like on a bird egg, it looks like it's hard and thick, diffusion can occur across that. So the chorion absorbs and releases gases depending on gradient, diffusion gradient. So we talked about the amnion. There's a little bit of a yolk sac, which is a little bit of food to start with. Even in humans, there's a little bit of a yolk sac. Now, since there's a placental interface in humans, that yolk sac is not significant in terms of providing sustenance, but for things like birds and reptiles, obviously that yolk sac would be very important. Now, this yolk sac is a lot like the endosperm, right? That we talked about in angiosperms, providing a little bit of food. That whole idea of less offspring, but providing a better chance for them to survive. The allantois is the waste from the embryo. So the allantois is where all the waste collects. In us placental organisms, the chorion and the allantois actually fuse together and become part of the placental interface. Mammals don't need a chorion for gas exchange. They don't need an allantois for someplace to store the waste, because that's what the placenta does, right? The placenta exchanges gases and also gets rid of the waste products. But again, the big thing here is that amniotic cavity, because when you have an amniotic cavity, you can lay eggs away from water. So this is a Komodo dragon coming out of a reptile egg. Reptile eggs are a little different than bird reptilian eggs. They're more, they have sort of a leather outer covering to them. It's not quite the shell that you find in birds. But reptiles in general have a drier skin that reflects their ability to conserve water. They have scales, or we call them scutes sometimes, made of keratin. Keratin is that hard structure, but keratin is like a cuticle, say like on a plant leaf, right? It actually helps hold the water in. We moved from buccal breathing. Remember, amphibians are buccal breathers. Buccal, their mouth, they gulp air and then they basically swallow, and it works for them, but it's not horribly efficient when it comes to getting in enough oxygen. So being a thoracic breather is much better. Increased lung capacity. You're a thoracic breather. Humans, we're a thoracic breather. We breathe from our chest, right? Our diaphragm is what causes our lungs to inflate and deflate. So you get bigger lungs, more lung capacity, higher metabolic rates. Internal fertilization, okay? That's going to be, of course, the norm with all animals that live on land. The egg now has a shell to protect it, either a leathery shell, or as we move into the bird reptiles, a much harder shell. Interesting thing about the dinosaurs, we've excavated some paleontological sites, and some of them actually seem to indicate that there was some maternal care in dinosaurs. So we'll dig up like a bunch of dinosaur eggs and young dinosaurs, and around those dinosaurs will be a lot of adult dinosaurs, in many cases female dinosaurs. So we wonder or hypothesize if the maternal care was already occurring back in dinosaurs. Now, it's not unusual for reptiles to exhibit maternal care. Alligators, of course, their females will defend their nests. But that is something that we can't observe in dinosaurs, obviously, but we can glean from the fossil record that maybe they were actually engaging in this kind of maternal care. All right, now as far as the heart goes, we're going to have two loops. We have the pulmonary and the systemic, just like we had before. And while we have a three-chambered heart, we have a partially divided three-chambered heart. So again, the blood is mixed, as you see in the purple there. But the partial division that I'm pointing to with the red arrow does help alleviate some of the problems of the mixing of the blood. So we get organisms that have higher metabolic rates, all right, but still relatively low. That's why reptiles are ectothermic, all right? They're cold-blooded critters. Cold-blooded critters tend to have low metabolic rates. Remember, in warm-blooded critters, higher metabolic rates, one of the things that does is keep warm-blooded critters warm. And the advantage of being warm is you can increase the speed of other chemical reactions. You talked about in Bio 1 with enzymes, right? Warmer the temperature, the faster the enzymes work. So warm-blooded critters can have higher metabolic rates because of the fact that part of the warmth, or the warmth they're getting from, is from their digestion of food, right? So it's an internal warmth that's being generated. Ectotherms, like most reptiles, except for the birds are like us, by the way. The birds are warm-blooded, just like you and us. Ectotherms, their body temperature is determined by the environment. That's why oftentimes cold-blooded critters will engage in something we call behavioral thermal regulation. Lizards, you see them all the time, will lay along the sidewalks on sunny days. What they're doing is they're absorbing the heat from the sidewalk to warm up their bodies, which allows them to move faster. And if you think about the case of a predatory lizard hunting prey, that would be an advantage. So they'll warm up on the rocks or on the sidewalk, then go hunting prey. And of course, if they have to hunt their prey, say in a shaded area, they'll begin to cool off. And as they do, they move back over to the warm area to warm up again. That's why we call it behavioral thermal regulation. So maybe we would call this a 3.5 chambered heart. Now, even amongst the reptiles, there is a branch of that bush that has been experimented and ended up forming the 4-chambered heart. The crocodilians, for example, which is a reptile. The birds are actually the reptile lineage that birds are most closely related to are the crocodilians. And of course, mammals, we have a 4-chambered heart. And when we get into mammals, we'll take a look at that again. But more chambers to the heart, higher metabolic rates. So that means the crocodilians have higher metabolic rates among reptiles, and birds have the highest metabolic rate among reptiles, because not only do they have a 4-chambered heart, but they're also warm-blooded critters. Reptile evolution. Right. Earliest reptiles were around about 310 million years ago. So this is before the Mesozoic and the dinosaur era. And when we look back through the fossil record, we see this evolutionary trend amongst the skulls. Now, what's going on amongst the skulls in general is a lightening of the skulls. So you look up above, we have the 3 types of reptilian skulls. Now, these are skulls that we find in the fossil record and skulls that exist in some reptiles today. We have an anapsid skull, the synapsid skull, and the diapsid skull. Now, the difference between them is the anapsid skull has no openings. The opening that you see in the anapsid skull right here, this is the eye opening, the eye orbit. We're not counting that. With the synapsid skull, we have an opening there. And with the diapsid skull, di meaning 2, we have 2 openings. Essentially, what we're doing is we're lightening the skulls. Now, anapsid skulls exist today in reptiles. One of the best examples of a reptile with an anapsid skull would be sea turtles. Sea turtles have very heavy, bulky skulls. Living in water, you can do that. Living out on the land, though, you would have seen this gradual trend towards lighter and lighter skulls, especially if organisms like the Tyrannosaurus, that's going right after this small little dinosaur that it's after, were standing up on high legs, holding their head up. Interesting thing about that picture of Tyrannosaurus, just for a second, we think that Tyrannosaurus may have been more of a scavenger than a hunter. Scavenging is a lot easier and cheaper. You don't have to kill anything. You just kind of walk up to where the kill was made and whoever did the killing, and you roar and you look real nasty and everything like that, and you chase everybody away, and then you're left with the carcass to feed on. But if we go back to what I said about carrier's constraint, there might be evidence too that these organisms were pretty quick on their hind legs, right? Because remember what we said, that sprawling gait in alligators means that when you move, you're constricting the lungs, but walking up erect the way Tyrannosaurus would, you're not doing that. So these organisms probably could move pretty quick. So maybe they did maybe if I were a Tyrannosaurus, I'd be both. Scavenger and a hunter. Those front legs don't do much good, right? But as we remember what's going on in the mammalian group here, is there's some group, or in the reptilian group, there's some group of reptiles that are going to modify those front appendages. And of course, who I'm talking about is the birds. All right, go back a little bit in time to Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon was a pelycosaur. It suggested that it was the first organism big enough to kill prey their own size. So it was a pretty good sized animal. A synapsid skull reptile, by the way, so living on land. Now, Dimetrodon is an interesting story because it has this sail on the back. The reason why that's interesting is we know birds are warm-blooded, but we always, and no present reptiles are warm-blooded except for the birds, but we wonder if there was some experimentation with warm-bloodedness among non-avian reptiles back then. Now, Dimetrodon is only known from the fossil record. It's gone extinct, but this sail suggests, in some people's minds anyway, that these animals may have been warm-blooded, in that the sail was used to either absorb heat from the sun, so the sail would have been highly vascularized, there'd been a lot of blood vessels in there, and in addition, being highly vascularized, the sail could have been used to get rid of the excess heat. So Dimetrodon may have been an organism that could perhaps maintain a stable body temperature like we do, or And there are some organisms today that can do this. For example, white sharks. There was an interesting paper that came out a number of years ago that white sharks can actually elevate their body temperature above ambient at certain times. Many times right after they feed. Right after they feed, their internal body temperature will rise because it speeds up the digestion process. But the difference between that and being true warm-blooded is we maintain a constant body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, right? The white sharks, maybe Dimetrodon, could elevate their body temperature above ambient, but they couldn't. And so they could bring it a few degrees above what the air temperature was outside, but they couldn't maintain a constant body temperature. So that's the difference between them. During the Triassic period, which would have been the very first period in the Mesozoic era, so when the dinosaurs were starting to rise to their prominence, we have groups of groups of reptiles we call the Lepidosaurs. And the Lepidosaurs gave rise eventually to organisms we call the Tuataras, which we'll look at, and also as well as the lizards and the snakes. The Archosaurs, these were the first land vertebrates to be bipedal, so Tyrannosaurus would have been in this group. Crocodilians, pterosaurs, the Tyrannosaurus, and then in parentheses I indicate something important, the birds. All right, birds are bipedal, aren't they? They walk on their hind legs. And their front appendages have been modified into wings. So look at that Tyrannosaurus again and think about those little tiny front legs in the front. That probably couldn't be very helpful as far as capturing or holding prey, but a group related to them took those front appendages and made them into something very useful. The dinosaurs dominated for probably 150 to 200 million years. Of course, they all have gone extinct, as we all know, except for the birds. Now, during this time is where we start to see the beginning of mammalian evolution. Well, not during this time, but we start to see advancements in mammalian evolution. For example, that thing that you're seeing there, that picture right there, it looks like a rat, is actually not a mammal. It is a therapsid reptile. Therapsid reptiles were mammal-like reptiles. And they, about 250 million years ago, they replaced the pelycosaurs, the Dimetrodons, in terms of prominence, okay? Synapsid skulls may have been endothermic. And the reason why we think they may have been endothermic is because they would have had this, this covering, this fur-like covering that would have kept them warm. These guys are all extinct now, about 170 million years ago. But your lineage, our lineage, that squirrel that's attacking that Tyrannosaurus Rex model down below, comes through that therapsid line. So while the dinosaurs were kicking the crap out of the mammals for millions of years, when the dinosaurs went extinct, these therapsid reptiles, through evolutionary changes, eventually gave rise to the lineage, gave rise to mammals. So now the tables have turned, aren't they, right? Now it's the mammal's turn. I always think about that when Cooper's chasing lizards on the back porch. My wife's like, oh my God, don't let him catch it. It's so gross. And I'm like, hey, you know what? Those lizards, those reptiles had their chance 65 million years ago. Now it's time for the mammals to rule. So, and maybe that's what that squirrel was doing there. Okay, let's take a look at the different types of reptiles that we got. So let's look at the lineage. We got the turtles, and of course there's some extinct groups here, the ones with the crosses, the pterosaurs, the Ornithian dinosaurs, the Saurischian dinosaurs. The Saurischian dinosaurs, again, would have been like Tyrannosaurus. You can see there are the birds. That's why we say birds are relatively closely related. The ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs, tuataras, lizards, and snakes, they're all around today. The turtles, which we're not sure exactly of their phylogeny. We're not sure if turtles were archosaurs or lepidosaurs, but they're a member that's around today as well. And then, as I mentioned before, those little synapsid reptiles, those little therapsid reptiles that we're looking at, they came down here, right? And that's where we lead to the mammals. But let's go back up to the turtles for just a second. Turtle reptiles are known for the most part by their shells. They have a dorsal carapace, and then they have a ventral plastron. So this is a painted turtle. Gets its name from the fact that it's so colorful, and that's the plastron. This is chicken turtle, they call it, and that would be the carapace, the top. Tortoises are terrestrial with a domed carapace. Turtles are usually aquatic, and they have a much flatter or disc-shaped carapace, like you see in the sea turtles down here. Loggerhead, that's a green sea turtle. This is a leatherback sea turtle. They're huge, they get massive in size. Sea turtles crawl up on the beach and lay eggs, so they kind of like the opposite of the amphibians. They go back to the land to lay eggs. Females are the only ones that will come up to land after they're born. The males, once they're born and crawl out in the water, they stay out there forever. So mating occurs right offshore, and the females will come up on the beach, just very commonly in Florida, especially over on the East Coast and the West Coast, and they'll dig a nest and lay about 100 eggs. They dig lay a clutch of eggs. And about 50 or so days later, that clutch of eggs will hatch, and out of that will come the little sea turtle hatchlings. Now, there is some interesting research that's been done on sex determination in reptiles. Sex determination in reptiles actually is dependent upon temperature, so that they find in a nest of sea turtle eggs, and I don't remember which way it goes, but the eggs near the top are going to be warmer. The eggs near the bottom are going to be cooler, and that's going to affect the sex ratio of those eggs, whether they're at the top or the bottom. I can't remember if they're warmer. They're usually female, and cooler if they're male. I don't recall the specifics of that. I told you earlier in your field notebooks that if you found evidence of animals, that would work as well. So this is the gopher tortoise burrow, and as we said, gopher tortoises and tortoises have a domed carapace. You remember I told you how to identify a gopher tortoise burrow. It looks like a big D. This is the soft-shelled turtle we have here in Florida. This is a gopher tortoise. This is a snapping turtle. We have snapping turtles here in Florida as well. Very strong jaws. I remember one time in graduate school we found a snapping turtle, and somebody took a good sized stick. I don't know, maybe it was a ½ inch in diameter, I guess, and kind of put it up near the mouth of this turtle. And that turtle grabbed that stick and snapped it right in half. So there's something to be said for them being called snapping turtles. All right, so turtles, we move our attention now to the lepidosauurs. The first group we're going to look at is a group that you have never seen before unless you've been to New Zealand. These are the tuataras, and they're only found on New Zealand. 2 species, seen some evidence or some suggestions of 3 species. And the little black dots that you see there are the range of where the tuataras are found now. Now, originally, their ancestors lived back during the dinosaur era, 220 million years ago. And originally, they had much wider distribution up through the end of the dinosaurs. But now they're only found on a few islands, about 30 islands near New Zealand. The mainland population is gone. It's been destroyed by cats who eat their eggs. And that's always a problem sometimes when humans move into island environments. Many organisms that have evolved on islands have lost the ability to either be frightened by or defend themselves against certain predators. Cats, for example. So when cats are brought over by humans, these predators or these organisms suffer quite a bit of egg predation or egg loss from the cats. Now, if you look at the very top of a tuatara, my son was in New Zealand a few years ago, and I tried to get him to go get me a picture of a tuatara, and he said they're all on natural preserves. But he did give me a picture of one that was in a zoo in Australia, which is kind of cool. But if we look at the top of a tuatara, the picture in the bottom, I'm pointing the red arrow to it, there's a special little cell, and that's called a parietal eye. And it contains an eye, a lens, and a retina, but that's covered over by scales at the top of their head. Now, they can't really see anything out of that eye so much as they can tell day length. They use this parietal eye to regulate their circadian rhythms, right? Their daily rhythms. Every living thing has got a circadian rhythm. You and I, we have circadian rhythms. It's why we feel tired when we do, why we wake up when we do, it's, why you're hungry when you are. It's all part of that. Well, this parietal eye in the tuatara lets them know the circadian rhythm, lets them know if it's daylight, if it's night, if it's morning, if it's afternoon. Well, this ability to be able to tell this by using a parietal eye has not been lost on humans. Now, we don't have a parietal eye, so don't run to the mirror looking for an eye at the top of your head. But if we dissect it open your brain, in your brain you have a thing called a pineal gland, right about there. And that pineal gland is very close to the nerves that come from your eyes and where they cross over. It's actually your nerves from your eyes, the right eye nerve goes to the left side of the brain and vice versa. So it crosses over, forms an optic chiasma. There's that word again, chiasma. We know what that means, right? Right about at that optic chiasma, that pineal gland sits. So that pineal gland that's deep inside of our brain basically does the same thing. It senses by the nervous impulses moving down the optic nerve, it senses the time of day and establishes our circadian rhythm. So it's our connection all the way back kind of to the reptilian world, isn't it? Right? We may not have a parietal eye, but we do have a pineal gland. This is all wonderful stuff if you think about talking about relationships between organisms, right? Talking about similarity, common ancestors, and that sort of stuff. Oh, the lizards and the snakes. All right, very cool. Lizards and snakes. Everybody loves lizards and snakes. This is the Squamata. Let's take a look at the lizards first. Biggest group of reptiles are the lizards and the snakes, except for the birds. They're a bigger group. Males have paired copulatory organs called hemipenes. I have a picture of it. I have a picture of snake hemipenes. There we go. Which is the same thing we saw in the shark, with the shark dissection, right? It had two claspers. All right, so they have two hemipenes, paired copulatory organs. Lizards, of course, are a member of this group, very well known for regenerating their tail. They allow their tail, they disconnect their tail when a predator is threatening. The tail flops around, and hopefully the predator goes after the tail and leaves them alone. This is tiger geckos. I think these are called tiger geckos. You can see in this, you can actually tell the tail has been regenerated. Now, on the anoles and the lizards that crawl around campus, you could tell very often a regenerated tail, their tail usually comes to a sharp point. The regenerated tail is usually stubbier, and that indicates. Now, you can only lose that tail once. It only happens once. There are venomous species of lizards, too, like the Gila monster, southwestern United States, the beaded lizard from Mexico. This squirrel, he ain't got no problem with that Gila monster, does he? We have a gecko here in Florida. It's called the Mediterranean reef gecko. It looks like that. Big eyes. See them sometimes on your back porches at night. It's actually an introduced species. Came from the Mediterranean. Blue-tailed skinks. Skinks, there's a big groups of lizard called skinks. They're very shiny and slick skin. That's a particularly pretty one, blue-tail. There are lots of those here in Florida. I've seen some on campus, actually. And, of course, the Komodo dragon there in the middle. Voracious, vicious organism. Can grow up to 3 meters long, weigh in the vicinity of 135 kilograms. So we're talking somewhere like, about 200 pounds. One of the organisms out there that have been known to stalk and hunt human beings. So these are predators of humans. Many times what they do, and this happens among the Komodo dragons, one of their effective hunting techniques is around their teeth, they have all these bacteria that are growing. So when they bite something, they don't necessarily have to kill it right away. They bite it, let the infection from the bacteria set in. The organism they bit then crawls off someplace and dies, and then they smell it out and they scavenge on it. Again, it's kind of like the whole idea of being a scavenger being easier than trying to kill something that's alive. Killing something that's alive is not going to go peacefully. But if you're a scavenger, right, it's already dead. So the Komodo dragon says, well, I'll bite you, die later, then I'll go back and feed upon you, and it's a lot easier. And the last group of reptiles, not the last group, last group of the Squamata reptiles are the snakes. They have a legged ancestor. There's a fossil of a snake back from the evolutionary past. So you can see the legs. Legged ancestor, carnivorous adaptations, folks. These have sensors, all kinds of sensors. They have, in pit vipers have a heat-seeking pit that they can sense heat. Mammal eaters, right? Because mammals give off heat. They have an organ at the top of their mouth called the vomeral nasal organ. And what happens there, you always see the snake is always flicking its tongue. the tongue gathers chemicals from the environment, and when they pull the tongue back in their mouth, it rubs over this Jacobson's, this vomer nasal organ. It's also called the Jacobson's organ. And the chemicals that are on the tongue get delivered to that organ and basically smell that way. Vipers many times can pretty much eat things much bigger than them. And if you take a look at their jaw structure, they have very distendable jaws. The back of their skull is very loosely attached, very loosely hinged together, so they can open their mouth quite wide. Of course, vipers are venomous. You can see the little drop of venom right there. The venom is delivered through the fangs from venom glands up above. This is obviously an example of a viper that's venomous. Now, rattlesnakes and their relatives and cottonmouth, there's cottonmouth. Cottonmouth are called that because they have a nice white mouth. Oh, in the background here, there's a good example of a snake distending its jaws. Look at that snake. It's swallowing that gator there. The kind of toxin that we find in rattlesnakes and moccasins is called a hemotoxin. So it affects the blood. It causes tissue degeneration. I mentioned the other day, folks who handle vipers a lot are usually missing a finger or two. The coral snake up above there, this is one I took a picture of in my front yard. They're not horribly aggressive. They have fangs. They have the more primitive type of fangs. They don't have the viperish fangs. What they basically do is have hollow teeth. They have to chew on you to impart their venom into you. And the venom in this case is neurotoxic. So it actually kills you by stopping your ability to breathe. There are snakes that live in the water. This is a sea snake, highly venomous, but very friendly. There are many divers report diving with sea snakes. They're found in Indo-Pacific area, or about Australia. This is the old Amazon anaconda. This is a neat snake. This is a story about a woman coming across that river there behind her in a canoe, and they had some chickens on the canoe that she was bringing across that they were going to obviously use for food. The canoe overturned, and she recovered all the chickens except for one, which an anaconda reached up and grabbed. And when she came back and told the village men about that, they went out and caught the anaconda and then cut it open and took their chicken back. Because snakes, of course, swallow their food whole. This is a black racer on my back porch. A few years ago, my wife called me at work all hysterical that there was a snake crawling around the back porch. And when I asked her to describe it to me, it was a black racer. Of course, there's a sliding glass door here, and I remember she was on the phone with me. She's like, "Oh my God, it's crawling towards the sliding glass door." And I'm like, "Well, just shut the door. It doesn't have thumbs. It won't be able to get in." Black racers aren't venomous, but they will bite you. So I came home later on, and this guy and I chased each other around the back porch a couple of times till he finally crawled up into a barbecue grill that I have over here kind of off to the left. And then while he was in the barbecue grill, I took the barbecue grill in the back of my truck. We went out in the woods and dumped the grill. I took the grill back, and the snake crawled off. He was fine. Yeah, black racers on campus, too. I've seen a couple hanging around the science building, actually, too. Oh, then the crocodilians, last reptile group. Oh, well, before we get to the birds. Still doing it. Got to remember the birds are now officially reptiles. 23 species of crocodilians. There are things called gabals, garrels, or caimans. This is a caiman. Usually tropical, found in warm areas. Large, carnivorous, stealthy predators. Made for stealth. Nostrils at the top of the nose. Eyes at the top, so they can, you've seen them in the water. They can float with just their nose and their eyes sitting above. This is a picture of one I took out at the Wakaiber River. He's not being very stealthy, but of course, you've seen him in the rivers and the lakes before with their eyes and just their nose sticking up above. This is the young of our alligator mississippiensis. This is the alligator. We do have a crocodile here in Florida. Crocodiles do exist. And of course, there's always the idea is how you tell one from the other. Well, it's kind of weird. For one thing, the snout on a crocodile is pointed, and on an alligator, it's rounded, more rounded. When the mouth is closed on a crocodile, you can see teeth in both, but you can see lower teeth specifically up at the front. That lower tooth showing that indicate it's a crocodile. I just remember by head shape, and I remember it opposite. I remember alligator A is sharp, but they have the blunt snout, and crocodiles, the C is round, but they have the sharp snout. And oh, by the way, they can climb fences. That's an actual picture of an alligator here in Florida climbing a fence. I think the picture is about a 4-foot chain link fence, so they are good at that. Look at the size of this one over here. I believe that's an Australian version. It's a big animal. And that guy standing that close, he's got some serious nerve doing that. Crocodiles are typically nocturnal. As I said, they're actually more like birds than they are reptiles. They have maternal care. They build nests, 4-chambered heart. 2 species of alligators today, the one we have here and one in China. The gavals, the garrels, and the caimans, a lot of caiman species you found in the Caribbean. Everybody knows how to get away from an alligator chasing you, right? So this is you, and this is the gator. Which way do you run to get away from an alligator? Don't say away from, that's obvious. They move quickly. They can move, in some cases now, crocodiles up to 40 miles an hour, but in order to escape them, you run diagonally, back and forth. They're not very good at changing direction. I think, to me, my adage of making sure that if I'm around gators, I'm always not by myself is probably a better bet. As long as I can outrun somebody in the group, then I'm not worried about it. All right. Now, let's turn our attention now to the last group of reptiles, the bird reptiles. Notice once again, when we look at the bird reptiles, we understand what we mean by the birds being the closest living relative of dinosaurs. And some folks actually would say that birds are basically dinosaurs, okay? Dinosaurs that have changed since the dinosaurs ruled the earth, but nonetheless, basically dinosaurs. You can see they're pretty closely related to them. Very diverse group, 10,000 species of birds, still with a lot of reptilian traits, all right? So some of the evidence of these organisms is morphological. For example, amniotic eggs. Now, that alone isn't evidence of direct relationship to reptiles. For example, we lay amniotic eggs. Scale are eggs. They have scales on their legs. Up here, chicken legs have scales on them. Very much the kind of scales that you would find on a reptile, right? Very similar to the scales maybe you might find on a fish. No tail, no teeth. So that's where they kind of diverge from the reptilian line. No tail or teeth. Feathers that we've talked about. Feathers that originally arose to keep them warm. These are warm-blooded critters. Okay? So feathers, this is an acceptation, originally developed to keep the animals warm, and then later on, fortuitously, allowed the animals to fly. We'll talk a little bit more about the evolution of the feather in just a second, about how that worked. But let's talk about where these feathers came from. Feathers evolved from reptilian scales. They're made of keratin, and if you look in the lower right, I'm going to show you kind of how this works. What we're looking at in the lower right is we're looking at, this is the epidermis and dermis of the skin of, let's say, some ancient reptile that eventually gave rise to birds. And there's a placoid. Now, a placoid, there's many different kinds of placoids out there. A placoid is a lump of cells, not a tumor, that's pathogenic, but it would be a lump of cells. In this particular case, this is a feather placoid. And so what we think evolutionary through time happened, and you can kind of look back and forth between these two, because we're looking at it from different angles, the side or just kind of standing back looking at gross morphology. That feather placoid began to grow. Began to grow into a dermal papillae, which eventually had a pulp around it and a follicular cavity. And so if you look down below, you're looking at the three-dimensional arrangement. Now, what that means in terms of development of feathers, if you looked at the picture on the left, that feather placoid grew that extension, that dermal papillae. That dermal papillae in stage 2 began to branch out. The branching became more complex with a central vein. We added more of the side veins to it as time went on. And then what you may not notice between 4 and 5, what the difference between those, 5 looks like it has a lot more of the other parts of the feather, but also notice that 5 is asymmetrical. You see what I mean by that? You look at the central spine, in feather number 5, the parts of the feather on the right side are bigger than the parts on the feather on the left side. That's significant because you can't fly with symmetrical feathers. You have to have asymmetrical feathers. Okay. Now the feathers not only are asymmetrical, but they're designed in such a way, if you look in the upper right, where they can hook together. They have these hooks and barbs, and the feathers are designed in such a way that those hooks and barbs engage as the feather moves down on the power stroke, or the wing does, and it allows air to move through as the bird moves up on the upstroke. Now, flying is something kind of interesting to me, because basically the way planes and everything flies is not by the air underneath the wings, but by the vacuum above the wings. And birds are no exception. When birds flap their wings, what they do is they create a reduced air pressure pocket above the wings. That's a vacuum. Mother Nature bores vacuums. So what happens is the bird drifts up into that vacuum to fill that vacuum. Same thing with a plane. As a plane is moving down the runway, it takes to flight when the air passing over top of the wing, which takes a little bit longer, causes this lower air pressure to form, this vacuum, if you will, and the plane lifts up into the vacuum. Same reason how sailboats work, by the way. The sail on a sailboat, okay, if you were basically tacking into the wind, if the wind was blowing, say, from kind of like this direction, the reason why the sailboat would continue to travel that way is because you're creating a reduced pressure area behind it. The sailboat is kind of falling into that reduced pressure area. And there's a couple of other things that indicate to us this advancement towards flight. The bones are thin and hollow. It's kind of like the tracheal air sacs we talked about in the bee. Many of the bones are fused together for added strength, like, for example, the wishbone and this keel bone, very strong. Large bones, or bones with large surfaces, like in number 4, indicate large muscle attachment. And large muscle attachment in this area indicates an animal that needed a strong muscular attachment in the chest area, if you will, for, of course, the flapping of the wings. So when we look into the fossil record, we can get an idea of when birds started having the ability to fly by, basically looking at the size of this keel and how it developed in size. Now, just as kind of a hint to the mammals for just a second, birds, reptiles, and bird reptiles, and reptiles give rise to mammals. We've already talked about that, but mammals have hair and birds have feathers. I like to think about birds and mammals as being two variants of the same theme. Because if you look at a baby chicken, before those become feathers, that looks like hair, doesn't it? Now, it's not hair, excuse me, but in mammals, what formed hair was another placoid. It wasn't a feather placoid, it was a hair placoid. So you can see back there at this time where you get organisms that are experimenting evolutionary with these placoids. And in one branch, we went off and formed feathers, which fortuitously later on became good for flight, but initially were very good for staying warm. And then the other warm-blooded critter out there didn't go the feather route, it went the fur route. Because the hair on mammals, for the most part, is necessary for keeping in warm, because we're warm-blooded critters. That's what I mean. It's kind of like I said, it's a variation of the same theme. All right. Of course, everything when we think about birds, we think about flight. How do they fly? What are some of the adaptations? All right, no urinary bladder. All right, let's wait. So they pee as they need to. Females have one ovary instead of two, one ovary. It enlarges during breeding season. In the case of the males, they have one testicle, and it enlarges during the breeding season. That's what stimulates them to sing. Male birds are singing when they have enlarged gonads, because, of course, that's the mating season. I'll skip the middle part for a second. They're warm-blooded again, high body temperatures, some cases at 40 to 42 degrees of very high metabolic rates, which explains why things like hummingbirds have heartbeats somewhere in the vicinity of, I think, about 180 beats. No, I'm sorry, 1,260 beats a minute in a hummingbird. That's incredible. All right, what's about this respiratory and circulatory system? All right, first of all, the circulatory system is a 4-chambered heart, no mixing of the blood, just like us. So that's going to increase metabolic rate, going to increase metabolic efficiency, because the blood coming out of the heart is fully oxygenated. Well, what's really interesting about birds is the way they breathe. Their respiratory system. We say birds are double breathers. Now, you look up at the blue jay up in the upper right, and it's indicating a front air sac, lungs, and a rear air sac. All right. So jump down below to the schematic picture. Let me show you how it works in bird breathing. Okay, we're going to start at the top, inspiration 1. All right, so this is the lungs. Oh, well, it's labeled down here. Posterior air sac and anterior air sac. Now, keep in mind, again, this is an organism that's trying to extract every bit of oxygen out of the air because it engages in a very high metabolic activity. Flight is very expensive metabolically. All right, so the bird inhales. Air travels, we're looking at the red, air travels to the posterior air sac. In the posterior air sac is vascularized. So in the posterior air sac, you can get some gas exchange to occur. You can get some oxygen to be absorbed and carbon dioxide to be released. The bird exhales. The air from the posterior air sac, as opposed to us where it would leave the lungs, does not leave the body. It goes in the lungs now, where continued absorption and transfer of the gases occurs. All right? Bird inhales again. Now, when the bird inhales again, the breath that it inhales goes to the posterior air sac. So we're back up here at number 1. And the air that was in the lungs doesn't leave the body quite yet. It goes into the anterior air sac, where more gas exchange occurs. That breath of air that was inhaled on inspiration 1 is not exhaled out of the animal's body until it's exhaled the second time around during expiration 2. Now, this double breathing, or I actually should call it triple breathing because it goes through the posterior and the anterior air sacs and the lungs, reflects the demand for high oxygen levels. This extracts every last, well, maybe not every last ounce, but almost every last ounce of oxygen. We're not as efficient. We inhale through our lungs, and then we exhale, and we exhale mostly carbon dioxide, but there is some oxygen in there too. We don't assimilate all the oxygen. These guys are assimilating as much as they possibly can. Now, that's good for them in flight. Wasn't so good for them when they were brought into coal mines. You know, the old canary in a coal mine saying that they say up above, there's a coal miner. He's got a caged bird, a canary. I don't know if they always used a canary, but they used a bird. And the reason why they did is years ago, before they had all of these sensing equipment that could tell when poisonous gases and toxic gases were building up in coal mines. Coal mines are heavy in methane and other toxic gases that can kill human beings. They'd bring the bird down there. And since the bird extracts much more out of the air per breath than a human does, the bird is going to get a much faster dose of the toxins in the air before the human does. So if you're a coal miner, and they don't do this anymore because nobody wants to hurt the birds, but if you're a coal miner, what you do is you stay down in the coal mine, and if the bird dies, it's time for you to leave. The bird died because, of course, like I said, it is much more sensitive to those toxic fumes, not because it's physiologically more sensitive, but because it extracts more out of the air. So that is the reasoning or the logic behind using a bird to detect noxious gases or poisonous or toxic gases in the air, because they are such efficient breathers. Where did birds come from? Well, like I said, they're remnants of the dinosaurs, right? So basically what we call the beast feet dinosaurs, or the theropod dinosaurs. Tyrannosaurus, like you see in this picture here, was a beast feet or a theropod dinosaur. So was the 5 up top, Sinosauropteryx, Velociraptor from the Jurassic Park fame, Caudipteryx, Archaeopteryx, which we already talked about, then of course the modern birds. Let's follow along what was happening here in these critters. So Sinosauropteryx on the far left-hand side, and there's a picture of what it looked like down below. Doesn't look much like a bird, but it had short arms. All right, had short arms, looked like Tyrannosaurus. His body was covered in filaments that it might have been used for warmth, for insulation. Okay, so not really feathers yet, but the first evidence of those. Velociraptor came on the scene and had a swiveling wrist bone. Now that swiveling wrist bone is a necessary adaptation for birds, modern birds, to be able to fly. Okay, Caudipteryx came along and started, evolutionarily speaking, we actually have feathers at this point in Caudipteryx, but they're symmetrical. Symmetrical feathers are good for staying warm, but they're not good for flying. We don't get asymmetrical feathers until we get to Archaeopteryx. So here's what Caudipteryx looked like down here. Look at the dinosaur. Look at the the dragonfly. There's Caudipteryx. You can see the feathers, symmetrical. Velociraptor, remember, was that organism that had a really nasty claw on it, if you remember from the movie. Here's Archaeopteryx, asymmetrical feathers, so could fly. Maybe not long distances, but could fly maybe like a chicken. And that would have been an advantage that we talked about in evolution, being the ability to fly a short distance, maybe to escape a predator. All right, so birds start flying. Now, if you take a look down the lower left, I'm showing you the evolution of the wing. The evolution of birds really took off, as you can see where I'm pointing with the red arrow, when a evolutionary innovation occurred in bird wings known as the Alula. A-L-U-L-A. I think that's a really cool word. As a matter of fact, in your field notebooks, one of you, I don't remember which one it was, had a picture of an eagle, if I remember, and the Alula was obvious. You could see it very distinctly. The Alula is that little wing right at the front of the bird's, well, little feather right at the front of the bird wing. It is the feather that would be controlled by the thumb, if you will. All right, so it's like the thumb feather. Now, what's so special about an Alula? Well, for one thing, it must have something to do with the evolutionary success of birds, because after the Alula arose or evolved, we see this exponential rise in bird diversity. All right, what the Alula does is it allows birds to maintain aerodynamic stability, in other words, the ability to still fly at low speeds. All right, now, same thing that the slats and the flaps do on the wings of a plane. Yeah, you've been on a plane before, obviously, and you know when the plane is taking off and landing, the front part of the wing moves out. That's called the slats, and the back part of the wing moves out. It's called the flaps. It's making the wing bigger. Making the wing bigger means more lift. It's more drag when the plane is flying. That's why they bring those things in. But when the plane is moving slowly, landing or taking off, it needs all the lift it can get. It expands out its wing with these slats and flaps and allows increased lift. That's what the Alula does for birds. So the Alula allowed birds to go into a much more controlled flight at slower speeds. That's why it was really cool, that picture of the eagle that someone had with the Alula, because I can only imagine that when that picture was taken, that bird must have got very close to stall speed. It must have been flying very slow since the Alula was sticking out so far. Isn't that neat? I love that, right? In biology and in evolution, how we're basically a little tiny change like that. That little tiny thumb feather makes all the difference to these guys. Turns them in from chicken flyers to really good flyers, if you will. Oh, where am I in here? Birds. Bird evolution. There's Archaeopteryx that we've seen before, lived around 160 million years ago. Part bird, part reptile, right? Part bird, part non-bird reptile. Let's call them non-avian reptiles. That's what basically we should call them, non-avian reptiles. Oh, look at the tree there. Ginkgo, right? See the ginkgos? Isn't that cool? All right, the orders of birds. There's 28 orders of birds. I don't expect you to know all of them, but I am going to point out a few of them, just curiosity or just because I want to, because I think they're cool. The ratites, or the Struthioniformes, are the rhea, the ostrich, the emu. These are flightless birds. They don't have that big, strong sternal keel bone that we were talking about. That would be another bit of detective work you could do if you were a paleontologist and digging up, ancient bird fossils. If you found a bird that had a very small sternal keel, then you might say, well, maybe this was a flightless bird. This group of birds are the most ancient of these birds. Now, not being able to fly is really no detriment, because the ostriches and rhea and even emus can run pretty doggone fast. The penguins, the birds that fly in water, the Spensiciformes, like the king penguin down the lower right, another important group. Back to the rhea and the ostrich and the emu for a second. Rheas are in South America, ostrich in Africa, emus in Australia. So it's kind of like the lungfish again, if you think about where they came from. Well, once again, we believe this is evidence of continental drift. That all of these species lived in the same area, more or less, and then the reason why they're finding such widely different areas now, South America, Africa, Australia, is because as the continents drift, they moved along with it. Remember, I talked about that in the lungfish too. Oh, the Passeriformes group. This is the big group. They arose sometimes about midway through the dinosaur era, the last group of the dinosaur, the Cretaceous, midway toward their last period. 60% of all species today are Passeriformes. These are the song or the perching birds. All Passeriformes are characterized by one special digit called a hallux on their feet that faces backwards. That's why they're called perching birds, because they can wrap their feet and take that hallux and wrap it around the other side. That's why they can sit on phone lines. If you ever have one sit on your finger, that's the hallux, that part that wraps behind. Passeriformes. Maybe penguins just need to flap their wings. Their wings do pretty well flying underwater, but on land they're walkers. Sometimes they get a little bit bored and they start sliding on their belly. And some more common birds. There is, of course, a cardinal, male cardinal, not to be confused with the Catholic version of a cardinal. Red-shouldered hawk and red-tailed hawks, very common in Florida. These two birds are the same species. They're both are boat-tailed grackles. The difference, the male is the darker, shinier one. The female is the duller brown one. So we got sexual dimorphism. Laughing gulls, which you've ever been to the beach and you've tried to take a nap, you've heard these laughing gulls are the ones that make that very annoying laughing sound in the background. And they do it incessantly. Blue jays, not to be confused with the baseball players. This is a scrub jay. Scrub jays are endemic to Florida, only found in Florida. They're also a threatened species, which means they're protected by the federal government. I've seen a few scrub jays, but in the wild, they're not that common to see. So the next time you see a blue bird, don't assume that it's just a blue jay. Take a look at it. It might be a scrub jay. And then up above is of course, everybody's favorite, the mockingbird. Mockingbird has a really cool scientific name, too. It's called Mimus polyglottis. Isn't that neat? Mimus, to mime, to mimic. Poly, mini. Glottis is throat. So the scientific name of mockingbirds basically tells us what they do, right? They mime many different kinds of sounds. It doesn't have to be birds. I've heard them do cats and all kinds of other sounds before. Oh, and then of course the dodo. Dodo was a flightless bird that lived on the island of Mauritius. You ever been to Mauritius, Daniela? I know that I heard that a lot of German folks. Oh, that's spelled wrong. I heard a lot of German folks vacation in Mauritius. It's out in the Indian Ocean. But back in 1598, European explorers arrived on the island of Mauritius, and they found these dodo birds, which looks like a big chicken. It was flightless, no experience with predators, certainly no experience with human beings. Oh, yeah, the Maldives are awesome. Yeah, I'd love to go there. I've never been there, but that would be cool. Yeah. So, look at this big bird that looks like a chicken. There's a lot of meat on this bird. The word dodo, which we kind of use in a horrible way to refer to someone that's not real bright, comes about because of the fact that these birds would go right up to humans, and then the humans just cut their heads off and eat them. So within a period of, less than 100 years, the dodo had gone extinct. Right? Human beings had totally wiped out the dodo population. Just goes to show you that human beings are good at causing habitat destruction. We're also good at directly causing the organism to go extinct simply because we just kill them all off. Amazing. Less than 100 years. All right. Now we're going to move on to the synapsid groups, which is going to include the mammals. This looks pretty. I'm just going to spend a couple of seconds getting into the mammals. I want to make the jump between the reptiles and the mammals. So here's what we have. We have the synapsid group, which are the organisms based on their skull, the lightening of the skull. And all of these critters in between here are non-mammalian synapsids. Right? There's this therapsid reptile that I talked about. But if you notice, like I said, we start from this reptilian group down here, right? Gave rise to the birds and the reptiles. The other type of reptiles, the synapsid reptiles, gave rise eventually to the three types of mammals that we're going to talk about. The monotremes, the marsupials, and then eventually the placental mammals. And we're a placental mammal. Give me an example of a monotreme. What's a monotreme? You probably know marsupials, right? Those are the pouched ones. But monotremes? Platypus is a monotreme. Monotremes lay eggs. It's a very ancient type of mammal. Again, weird mammals like that being oftentimes found in Australia, and that's where the platypus is found. Okay, so next week on Monday we'll finish up the mammals. We'll actually finish up this chapter. Remember, again, you do have your lab exam on Monday over chapters 5 and 7, so don't forget that. And then we'll, after the lab, or before, let's see. What do we want to do here? I still have a little bit to go over here. I could do that. I could do that next Wednesday. All right, and I'll post this as an announcement. So we won't do lecture Monday morning. We'll just do the lab exam. Make myself a note. And then I'll finish up the lecture that Wednesday. So we'll do mammals a week from today. All right, so there'll be no lecture Monday morning. I'll write myself a note and post a notice on Blackboard, okay? All right, so no lecture Monday morning. Lab exam starts at 9:30. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.